So I want you to picture this really specific scene. Picture a sprawling, sun-baked construction site down in South Texas.
Right, like one of those massive new residential subdivisions.
Exactly. The kind of place that promises, hundreds of new homes for this growing community. But instead of actually pouring concrete or framing roofs, the builders are out there spending thousands of dollars doing something completely counterintuitive.
It really makes no sense at first glance.
Yeah, they were building these massive temporary fences around completely empty dirt lots. And they aren't trying to keep thieves out of the site either. They are deliberately trying to trap themselves inside.
Which is just, I mean, that visual alone captures the sheer absurdity of what's happening.
It really does. Why are they doing this? Well, to force federal agents to actually get a judge's warrant before storming the property and taking away their entire workforce.
You've got these local businesses literally resorting to medieval siege tactics just to maintain a functioning labor pool against their own federal government.
It's wild. So, welcome to the Deep Dive, everyone. We are really thrilled you're here with us today.
Yes, welcome.
Because today we are unpacking this truly massive collision. It's a collision between abstract legal theory, hyperlocal economics, and this brewing psychological crisis in the American voter.
And we're looking at two very distinct sources today to do that.
Right.
When you put these two together, they reveal this stunning, just incredible picture. The first source is a detailed PBS News report.
Which is very dry, very factual.
Exactly. It breaks down a major ruling from the 8th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals regarding immigration detention. And then the second source is this fiercely passionate, highly analytical political commentary video from YouTube.
In that video, it takes us straight down into the Rio Grande Valley, right? To look at the unexpected economic and, well, political fallout of these federal policies on the ground.
Yeah, and then it scales all the way up to question the viability of modern global democracy itself.
It goes big. Really big. So if you're interested in constitutional law or, local economics or even just political psychology, stick around because there is a massive aha moment waiting for you in this deep dive.
The contrast between the two sources is really what makes this so revealing, I think.
Definitely.
Because the PBS report, it gives us the sterile clinical mechanics of the law, right? It shows us how just a single phrase in a legal document can be reinterpreted by a judge in this quiet courtroom.
It's a change of a few words.
Right. And then the YouTube commentary gives us the blistering, profane, and deeply frustrated human reaction to that reinterpretation as it plays out in real time.
Yeah, the commentator really pulls no punches in his critique, both of the Trump administration's aggressive enforcement and the voters who actually enabled it.
He is incredibly harsh.
Which brings up a really important point before we get fully into this. As we navigate this, our role is to act as your analytical guides. We are dealing with incredibly charged material here from both sides of the political spectrum.
Highly charged.
Exactly. So we want to make it absolutely clear that we are not endorsing these viewpoints. We aren't taking sides here.
No, not at all. Our goal is to objectively examine the arguments, the structural frameworks, and the actual on-the-ground realities presented in the source material.
Right. We want to understand the machinery. How does a semantic debate about a legal definition in St. Louis directly cause a home builder in Texas to go bankrupt? And why are the voters caught in the middle experiencing such profound shock?
Well, the mechanism connecting those 2 points, it really starts with the legal foundation.
Okay, let's start there. The courtroom.
Yeah, so according to the PBS News report, the 8th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals, which is based in St. Louis, they issued a ruling that essentially grants the United States government the authority to continue detaining immigrants without bond.
Without bond, meaning they just stay locked up.
Exactly. And to grasp the gravity of this, we really have to look at the specific catalyst case.
Right, the Joaquin Herrera Avila case.
Yes.
So the details of Avila's case, they really highlight the core tension here. He's a native of Mexico, but he'd been living inside the United States for years.
That's a crucial detail. Years.
Not days, not weeks. Years. Fast forward to August of 2025, and he is apprehended in Minneapolis, which, by the way, is a long way from the southern border.
Very deep in the interior of the country.
Yeah. And the charge is that he lacks the legal documents authorizing his admission into the U.S. So consequently, the Department of Homeland Security detains him.
They deny him the opportunity to post bond, and they initiate deportation proceedings.
Right. But Avila's legal team, they didn't just accept that. They immediately filed a petition for a bond hearing. And they actually won their first battle.
They did. A federal judge in Minnesota looked at the case and granted the petition, ordering that Avila be given a hearing to determine, if he could be released while his case was being processed.
Which makes sense because these cases can take a really long time, right?
Oh, absolutely. The immigration courts are massively backlogged. It can take months or even years.
So the reasoning of that lower court judge, it hinges on a very specific phrase in immigration law.
Yes, the exact wording is so important here.
The law permits mandatory detention without bond for a person who is, quote, seeking admission into the country if they are not clearly entitled to be admitted.
Seeking admission.
Right. And here's where the linguistic gymnastics really begin. The Minnesota judge ruled that Avila could not possibly be categorized as someone seeking admission.
Because the logic is straightforward.
Exactly. The man has physically lived in the country for years. He isn't standing at a border checkpoint handout asking to come in.
He hasn't filed paperwork for asylum or refugee status or naturalization.
He's just living his life. He goes to the grocery store, he goes to work. Therefore, the judge concluded, he's already here, he is not seeking to enter.
That lower court ruling treated the word seeking as an active present tense verb describing a physical reality.
Like an action you are currently taking.
Right. But when the government appealed that decision, kicking it up to the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals, the appellate judges stripped away that physical reality entirely.
They just threw it out.
Yes, and they replaced it with a purely legal abstraction.
Okay, let's create a mental model for this.
Yep.
Because legal abstractions can get confusing. Imagine a house, right?
Okay, house.
You walk up to the house, you step over the welcome mat, you walk into the living room, and you sit on the couch for 5 years.
Sounds comfortable.
Right. Now, the lower court judge looks at you and says, well, clearly, you are inside the house. You're on the couch.
Physical reality.
But when the appeals court looks at you, they say, well, because nobody officially handed you the keys when you walked in, the law refuses to acknowledge that you ever crossed the threshold.
That's exactly it.
Yeah.
Legally speaking, you are forever suspended in midair over the welcome mat.
Yes. You are perpetually in the act of entering the house.
That is an incredibly precise analogy for the 2-to-1 majority opinion written by Circuit Court Judge Bobby E. Shepard.
2-to-1, so it wasn't unanimous.
No, it was split. But the Eighth Circuit ruled that an applicant for admission is synonymous with an alien who is seeking admission.
Okay.
And that physical presence inside the country is legally irrelevant if formal admission was never granted.
So they just ignore the couch.
They ignore the couch entirely. By defining Avila as someone perpetually knocking on the door, the court strips him of the constitutional protections afforded to people who are recognized as being inside the house.
And specifically, that means the right to a bond hearing.
Exactly.
The dissent in this case, the judge who disagreed, is equally fascinating because it exposes just how dramatic of a shift this is.
Right. Circuit Court Judge Ralph R. Erickson wrote a fiery dissent.
Fiery for a judge, anyway.
Very true. He argued that the majority was deploying a, quote, novel interpretation of the law.
And when a federal judge calls an interpretation novel, I mean, that is basically judicial code for you are making this up out of thin air.
Yes, it's a very polite way of saying this is completely unprecedented. And Erickson backed up that accusation with historical data.
What kind of data?
Well, he pointed out that this new interpretation actively reverses 29 years of established legal precedent.
Wait, 29 years?
Almost 3 decades, spanning 5 different presidential administrations.
Wow. From Clinton to Bush, Obama, the first Trump term, and Biden.
Exactly. The established practice for all of them was entirely different.
So if Avila had been arrested at any point during those previous 29 years,
his physical presence in the interior of the country would have unquestionably entitled him to a bond hearing during his deportation proceedings.
overturning a quarter century of precedent is, I mean, it's seismic.
It's a massive shift in how the law operates.
And it's not just the Eighth Circuit doing this either. The PBS report notes that the Fifth U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals, down in New Orleans, handed down an almost identical ruling just a month prior.
So we are seeing a coordinated nationwide judicial shift here, one that empowers the Department of Homeland Security to unilaterally deny bond hearings.
So what is the broader legal consequence for an immigrant swept up in this? Especially, someone with zero criminal history.
Well, the immediate consequence is the systematic erosion of habeas corpus.
Habeas corpus. Let's bring that down for a second.
Yeah, it's an ancient legal principle. It dates back centuries. It basically guarantees a person's constitutional right to challenge the legality of their imprisonment before a neutral judge.
You can't just throw me in a dungeon and throw away the key.
Right. Historically, the government's power to enforce mandatory no-bond detention was strictly fenced in.
Fenced in how?
It was primarily applied to individuals caught right at the physical border attempting to cross, or to individuals with severe criminal convictions.
You're really dangerous people.
Exactly. If you were a non-citizen with no criminal record, living in the interior of the country, you had the right to ask a judge to set bail.
So you can go back home.
Right. Return to your family and your job while those heavily backlogged immigration courts processed your case, which, again, can take years.
The source provides a number that really puts the scale of this constitutional crisis into perspective. It references an Associated Press tally regarding these specific habeas corpus petitions.
And the number is just staggering.
What is it?
Immigrants have filed over 30,000 habeas corpus petitions in federal court alleging illegal detention just since the Trump administration took office.
30,000.
Yes. Think about the sheer volume of that.
That's the size of a small town.
30,000 individual human beings locked in detention centers, filing federal lawsuits, just to ask a judge if the government actually has the legal authority to hold them without bail.
That has to completely jam up the federal courts, too.
Oh, absolutely. And while many of those petitions were succeeding at the district court level...
Like there's that massive case in California, right?
Yes, where a judge ordered bond hearings for detained immigrants with no criminal history. But these new rulings from the Fifth and Eighth Circuits, they act as a judicial sledgehammer.
Smashing all those lower court victories.
Exactly.
Which I think is the critical pivot point in our analysis today. Because Washington issues a semantic ruling that redefines a word, seeking.
Right.
The appellate courts validate that redefinition. But a judge's pen doesn't physically detain people, does it?
No, it doesn't. That requires a massive deployment of federal agents actually on the ground.
And when you take this newly validated, extremely aggressive enforcement mandate and you drop it into a hyperlocal economy.
The theoretical concept of law and order collides violently with the reality of supply and demand.
Collides violently is the right phrase.
Right.
And that collision takes us straight into our second source.
The YouTube political commentary.
Right. Which provides this really intense boots-on-the-ground look at the Rio Grande Valley in South Texas.
We are leaving the sterile appellate courtrooms of St. Louis and walking right onto those dusty construction sites we talked about at the very beginning of the show.
The picture the commentator paints of this local economy is, honestly, it's apocalyptic.
It's devastating. Federal agents, specifically Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, they've been conducting relentless sweeps at local job sites.
Relentless.
Yeah.
We are talking about individual builders being raided 10 to 15 times across their various subdivisions.
10 to 15 raids.
Could you imagine running a business and the federal government raids you 15 times in a few months?
You can't function. The economic data provided in the video interviews with these local business owners is grim.
Tell me about the numbers.
Well, one builder reported a 60% reduction in their residential construction volume.
60%.
Yes, they literally watched more than half of their business just evaporate in a matter of months.
Wow.
That same business applied for bankruptcy in December. They cited a $5.3 million drop in sales.
$5.3 million.
And they were forced to lay off workers for the first time in their 40-year company history.
40 years of stable operations. I mean, think about that. They survived recessions. They survived the 2008 housing crash.
That's a great point.
Only to be completely broken by their own government's enforcement policy. Now, the administration's stated goal with these raids is to, quote, protect the nation's workforce.
Right, that's the rhetorical justification.
The theory is that if you remove undocumented labor, you open up high-paying jobs for American citizens.
But the builders in South Texas are screaming that this theory is entirely decoupled from reality.
Right. So why can't these companies just hire local citizens to replace the detained workers? I mean, surely there are people looking for jobs.
Well, the commentator's analysis highlights a fundamental misunderstanding of what economists call a fungible labor market.
Fungible labor market. Okay, break that down.
The federal policy assumes that labor is perfectly interchangeable.
Like widgets.
Exactly. They assume that if you remove a skilled, undocumented roof framer, there's just an unemployed citizen standing by, willing and able to jump onto a roof in 105-degree Texas heat for the exact same wage.
Which is brutally hard work.
It's incredibly hard, specialized work, and the Rio Grande Valley economy just doesn't function like a spreadsheet.
Right.
In this specific region, immigrant labor is deeply generationally integrated into the specialized trades of construction.
Generationally. So it's not just random guys, it's families who've been doing this trade for decades.
Exactly. Removing that labor pool doesn't create a vacuum that citizens rush to fill. It simply breaks the supply chain entirely.
The work just stops.
It stops completely.
And when the work stops, the economic contagion begins. The source notes that the damage, it doesn't stay confined to the construction site, does it?
Not at all. It infects the entire financial ecosystem of the county.
So how does that spread?
Well, county property records and interviews with local lenders, they prove how fast the rot spreads. Banks that specialize in lending to home builders suddenly reported a massive freeze in transactions.
Because nobody's building.
Right. One local lender stated their lending activity plummeted by 30 to 40%.
30 to 40% drop for a bank is massive.
Because if a builder can't find the labor to pour a foundation, they certainly aren't going to pull $1 million loan from the bank to buy the lumber.
Right, you don't buy the wood if you have no one to swing the hammer.
Exactly.
The video highlights one specific, devastating example of this timeline distortion. There's this massive 196 apartment development project in the valley.
That's a huge project.
Huge. It was originally underwritten and scheduled to take exactly 1 year to build.
1 year.
1 year. But because of the constant ICE raids, the subsequent labor evaporation, and quite frankly, the paralyzing fear among the remaining workers, the developer announced it will now take 3 years to complete.
3 years instead of 1.
Yeah.
Think about the compounding financial mechanics of that delay.
The carrying costs alone.
Exactly. That is 2 additional years of paying high interest on commercial construction loans without generating a single dime of rental revenue.
Because you can't run down a half-finished building.
Right. And that is 2 years of building materials just sitting exposed to the elements.
Wow.
And the ripple effect hits everyone. It hits the local diners where the framing crews used to eat lunch.
They lose their daily customers.
It hits the hardware stores where they bought supplies.
Yeah.
And the retail shops that rely on consumer confidence.
Because people are scared.
The commentator points out that fear is literally keeping shoppers at home, effectively starving the broader retail economy of South Texas.
Which brings us back to that incredible detail we started the show with. The desperation got so bad that before they started building those fences, a group of South Texas builders actually organized through their congressional representatives.
They formed a coalition.
Yeah, and they flew to Washington, D.C. in February. They managed to secure a face-to-face meeting with ICE officials to literally beg for a reprieve.
They were essentially saying, you are killing the very economy you claim to be protecting.
Right. And the response they received from ICE, well, it's a masterpiece of bureaucratic pragmatism.
That's one way to describe it.
So what did ICE tell them?
The federal officials explained a very specific loophole in their operational guidelines. They told the builders that if a construction site is an open dirt lot without a physical fence around the perimeter,
Right.
the government legally considers it public property.
Public property, even though it's privately owned by the developer.
Yes. And because it is classified as public property, ICE agents do not need to show up with a judicial warrant to enter the site and detain people.
Oh, so they can just roll up and walk right in.
Exactly.
Which triggers the ultimate irony of this whole situation. The builders return to South Texas, and they immediately start spending their rapidly dwindling capital to erect massive fences around all their properties.
Just incredible.
Right. I mean, the administration is famous for wanting to build a wall on the southern border to keep immigrants out. Meanwhile, the voters who elected that administration are building their own walls in South Texas to keep the federal government out.
Also, they can protect their immigrant workforce.
It's just wild.
The visual is surreal, but the tactical reality is really grim, even though the source notes that IC activity declined slightly after that D.C. meeting and the sudden appearance of all these fences.
So the fences worked somewhat.
Somewhat, yeah. But the fatal blow had already been delivered. The labor force was scattered, the banking confidence was completely shattered, and the economic momentum of the region was just dead.
Which brings us to, honestly, the most volatile and psychologically fascinating part of this deep dive.
It's the political reaction.
Right. We have to examine the political whiplash happening on the ground. Because the very people losing their businesses, the people applying for bankruptcy, the people frantically building fences to trap themselves inside their own job sites, these are the very same people who voted to put this administration in power.
It's a massive contradiction. And the YouTube commentator focuses an intense, highly critical, analytical lens on the voting demographics of the Rio Grande Valley.
Let's talk about those demographics.
Well, we are talking about a region where over 80% of the population is Latino.
80%.
Yes. And historically, for decades, this area was a reliable, unshakable stronghold for the Democratic Party.
Blue through and through.
Exactly. But the political tectonic plates shifted violently. In the 2024 election, voters in this specific area swung further toward President Trump than almost any other demographic in the entire country.
That is a massive swing.
Great.
The source actually suggests a two-part equation for why that swing happened, right?
Yes. First, it argues that the Democrats essentially took the community for granted.
Ah, the classic mistake.
They assumed the demographic destiny was secure, so they stopped showing up, they stopped campaigning, and they stopped listening.
Which creates a vacuum.
Exactly. And second, the Republicans aggressively filled that vacuum. They came in with massive localized economic promises.
Speaking directly to the entrepreneurial spirit of these small business owners.
Yes, focusing heavily on the economy. But now, the people who bought into those promises are experiencing a catastrophic level of buyer's remorse.
The commentator highlights a specific quote from a local Hispanic Trump supporter, and it really serves as the thesis statement for the entire video.
It really sums up the whole disconnect.
The voter is quoted as saying, quote, "I didn't think they'd go after nonviolent illegals."
That sentence.
Yeah, that sentence is the ignition switch for the commentator's outrage.
It really is.
And it's important to note how aggressive the source material gets here. The commentator does not offer sympathy to these business owners.
Not at all.
He uses incredibly harsh, condemning language. He even deploys highly charged terms, like Uncle Tom, to describe Hispanic voters who supported an aggressive deportation platform and are now, shocked that deportations are happening to their own communities.
The core of the commentator's critique is that these voters engaged in willful, arrogant ignorance.
Willful ignorance, because the signs were there.
Yes. He argues they ignored all available evidence, campaign rallies, explicit policy platforms, everything.
Right.
The commentator argues that these voters constructed an imaginary, highly localized version of the policy in their heads.
Like a custom-made policy just for them.
Exactly. They somehow convinced themselves that a massive, multi-billion-dollar federal deportation apparatus would be deployed with the surgical precision of a scalpel.
Right, that it would ruthlessly target the criminals somewhere else.
But would magically spare the reliable, hardworking, undocumented employees pouring concrete on their specific job sites.
It is a stunning display of cognitive dissonance.
Yeah.
The psychology at play here is fascinating. I was thinking about it. And it's basically the political equivalent of voting to release a lion into your neighborhood to deal with a burglar problem.
Okay, a lion.
Yeah, you vote for the lion, you cheer as the cage is unlocked, and then you act deeply betrayed when the lion eats your family dog.
That's a perfect analogy.
Right. You wanted the aesthetic of the lion. You wanted the feeling of law and order. But you arrogantly assumed you could dictate the appetite of the beast.
You thought the lion would understand the nuanced difference between the burglar and the pet.
Exactly. You thought the lion would recognize the subtle, unwritten social contract between you and your undocumented employees.
But the commentator points out that the administration itself isn't even pretending to make that distinction anymore.
No, they're not.
The source notes a significant rhetorical shift coming directly from the White House. The administration is no longer just talking about deporting violent criminals.
What are they saying now?
Well, the commentator highlights a graphic posted by the White House, explicitly bragging about net immigration falling across the country.
Wait, net immigration?
Yeah.
Not just illegal immigration.
Exactly. The total number of human beings migrating to the United States, period.
That is exactly the commentator's point.
Yes. The administration is publicly celebrating that they have successfully made the country, quote, less desirable to be in. Wow.
They are actively promoting a reduction in all forms of immigration.
So, therefore, the commentator argues the voters' defense of, I thought it was only about the criminals, is completely invalidated by the administration's own public relations strategy.
The cruelty, as the saying goes, is the point.
It really is. And this raises a massive question about the feedback loop of democracy itself. I mean, we are seeing incredible economic gain. We are seeing businesses collapse.
Generational businesses.
Right. And the source points out that the Democrats left a vacuum. The Republicans filled it with promises that are now destroying the local economy. So does the commentator believe this localized devastation will actually change voting behavior in the next election cycle?
Like, will they learn their lesson?
Exactly. Will the buyer's remorse translate into a course correction at the ballot box?
The source is profoundly pessimistic about that prospect.
Really? Even with all this pain?
Yes. While it acknowledges that some individual business owners are changing their tune simply because they are facing immediate financial ruin.
Sure, self-preservation. Right. But the broader commentary suggests that political identity has become entirely untethered from material reality.
Untethered.
The commentator stops looking at the Rio Grande Valley as just an isolated incident and starts viewing it as a localized symptom of a terminal systemic illness.
An illness infecting modern global democracy.
Yes.
And this transition takes us into the final, heaviest, and most provocative section of our deep dive today. The big picture.
It gets really philosophical here.
It does. The commentator uses the bankrupt builders in South Texas as a springboard to question the fundamental viability of the democratic experiment in the 21st century.
The macro theory presented in the video is that there is currently an, quote, unconscionable disconnect in the democratic process.
What does he mean by that?
He argues that there is no longer any logical relationship between what voters experience in their daily lives, what they tell pollsters they actually want, who they actually vote for, and what the government ultimately does once it holds power.
So the whole chain of causality is completely broken. The commentator makes a really fascinating historical comparison to illustrate this. He asks the audience to look back 150 years to the American Gilded Age.
Right, the late 1800s.
Yeah. Now, he fully acknowledges the severe flaws of that era, right? Rampant corruption, lack of civil rights, women and minorities legally barred from voting.
Obviously, huge issues.
Huge issues. But he focuses on the mechanical relationship between the voter and the policy.
Right.
He hypothesizes that even though the average voter in, say, 1875 might have had significantly less formal education than a voter today.
Their voting behavior was infinitely more rational regarding their own self-interest.
Exactly. It is an argument about the alignment of cause and effect.
The source suggests that in the 19th century, politics were deeply transactional and legible.
Legible, meaning you could read the outcomes clearly.
Yes. If you were a farmer who wanted a protective tariff on imported grain to save your farm.
You voted for the guy promising the tariff.
Exactly. And if you were a merchant who relied on cheap imports, you voted against him.
So the relationship between the ballot you cast and the food on your table was direct.
Direct and obvious. But today, the commentator argues that direct link has been severed by a highly engineered layer of abstraction.
He points the finger directly at the modern, multi-billion-dollar disinformation industry.
The consolidation of corporate media, the algorithmic manipulation of the internet, the rise of hyper-partisan echo chambers.
All of it. The argument is that while politicians have, always lied.
That's nothing new.
Right, but the machinery designed to distribute those lies is now so sophisticated and so psychologically invasive that it actively alienates the voter from their own material reality.
The voter in South Texas is so bombarded by nationalized culture war narratives about open borders and crime waves
that they will literally vote to deport their own framing crew.
Completely oblivious to the fact that their local economy relies entirely on that crew to function.
The national narrative just completely supersedes the local reality. And to prove that this isn't just a quirk of American politics, the commentator rapid fires a list of global examples.
He argues this systemic rot is happening in every major democracy on Earth.
Let's break down the mechanics of the international examples he uses, starting with the United Kingdom.
Okay, the UK. The source points to the UK as a prime example of voters repeatedly punishing themselves.
How so?
Well, for roughly 25 years, across multiple governments, British voters have consistently supported politicians pushing brutal austerity policies.
Austerity. So meaning severe reductions in public spending to cut government debt.
Yes, slashing budgets. And the commentator points out that these policies have systematically dismantled the National Health Service, slashed social safety nets, and stagnated wages.
But the voters keep voting for it.
They keep voting for the architects of these policies, whether it's the conservative Tories or Keir Starmer's modernized Labour Party.
So the voter complains about the broken hospital and then votes for the person who defunded the hospital. He also brings up Japan, which is a fascinating case study in democratic paralysis.
Japan is really interesting. They operate under a system that political scientists often describe as a dominant party democracy.
Meaning one party basically always wins.
Right. The commentator notes that the Liberal Democratic Party, the LDP, has remained in power almost uninterrupted for decades.
Decades.
Yes, they effectively run a one-party state within a democratic framework. And this is despite presiding over what is known as the lost decades.
All decades,
Mhm.
which is a massive drawn-out period of economic stagnation, deflation, and demographic collapse.
It's been really tough for their economy, and these voters are highly educated, they are deeply dissatisfied with the economy, and yet
They reflexively return the exact same party to power, election after election.
every single time.
And then he throws Hungary into the mix, pointing to Viktor Orban's continuous electoral victories, despite the commentator claiming that the standard of living and political freedoms there are deeply undesirable.
Right.
The sheer despair in the commentator's voice during this section is just palpable.
You can really hear the exhaustion.
He is essentially asking a huge question. If a voter can look a politician in the eye, listen to him promise mass deportations, vote for him, and then cry when the deportations bankrupt their business.
What is the functional purpose of a democracy?
Exactly. The commentator concludes that voting has been reduced to an aesthetic, just a superficial cultural performance that has absolutely zero bearing on actual policy outcomes.
This profound sense of political nihilism pushes the commentator to search for what he calls a hope pill.
A hope pill, like some evidence that human society is still capable of executing long-term progressive development.
Yes. But the place he looks for that hope is highly controversial.
Very controversial. Where does he look?
He looks toward authoritarian state building.
This is where the source takes a massive provocative leap.
It really is. The commentator points to China. Now, we have to be clear. The source explicitly acknowledges that China is an authoritarian state lacking social and political liberalism.
Right. There's no illusion about that.
No. But the commentator argues that, mechanically speaking, China is currently executing massive, undeniable increases in its standard of living, infrastructure development, and poverty reduction.
While Western democracies are completely paralyzed by partisan gridlock,
Exactly.
the commentator doesn't just stop at modern China either. He digs into the history of authoritarian movements to build a theoretical defense for strong, centralized control.
Yes, the source explores the historical strategies of several hardcore authoritarian systems to illustrate a specific point about preventing corporate capture.
Corporate capture. So he references the KPD, which is the Communist Party of Germany, during the Weimar Republic before Hitler's rise.
He references the Soviet Union under Stalin and the government of Cuba.
Now, to understand the commentator's logic here, and again, we are just looking at his logic impartially, we have to look at the underlying economic philosophy he is highlighting.
Right. What is the through line?
Let's unpack that logic, purely as the source presents it.
Yeah.
What is the through line connecting those regimes to the bankrupt builder in Texas?
Okay, so the commentator argues that these historical authoritarian regimes, despite their massive and well-documented brutality, they operated on a principle that he views as, quote, objectively correct in the context of state survival.
State survival.
That principle is the belief that without absolute managed control from a central authority, foreign capital and powerful corporate interests will inevitably infiltrate the country.
They'll buy off a politician
They'll exploit the working class.
and completely undermine any coordinated national progress.
Exactly. So the argument is that modern democracies are just too weak, too fragmented, and too easily manipulated by billionaire-funded disinformation campaigns to actually protect their own citizens.
The commentator is just so exhausted by the self-destructive behavior of the Democratic voter. He looks at an authoritarian system building a high-speed rail network and essentially says, well, at least the trains are getting built, whereas in America, we are just building fences around empty dirt lots.
That is the grim calculus the source arrives at.
It's very grim.
The commentator posits that democracy itself might inherently be an impeding factor to material progress in the modern era because it is too easily weaponized by the wealthy.
The elite can just use the disinformation industry to keep the working class permanently distracted by manufactured culture wars.
Ensuring the voters never unite to demand actual economic reform.
Right. But I have to push back hard on one of the commentator's core premises here.
Okay, let's hear it.
He points the finger at the internet. He points the finger at the multi-billion-dollar disinformation industry, and he specifically blames poor education for this massive disconnect between the voter and reality.
Right, it's a very common critique. If only people were better educated, they wouldn't vote against their own interests.
It's the standard rationalist argument. But the commentator actually contradicts his own thesis.
How so?
In the exact same breath, He mentions that highly educated, deeply socially progressive countries with incredibly strong public school systems and robust social safety nets.
Oh, right.
Places like the Netherlands, Sweden, Finland, and Norway,
Yes.
they're currently falling into the exact same populist, right-wing, xenophobic traps as the United States.
The source explicitly acknowledges this paradox.
Right. The commentator admits that America's education system is empirically worse than Scandinavia's, yet both regions are experiencing identical political symptoms.
So the mechanism can't just be bad schools.
No. If this exact same psychological disconnect is happening in a struggling Texas border town, a hyper-developed metropolis in Japan, and a pristine socialist democracy in Norway, then we aren't just looking at a failure of education.
What are we looking at then?
We are looking at a fundamental psychological breakdown in the feedback loop between the human brain and the modern state in the 21st century.
The sheer volume of it all.
Exactly. The amount of information we are asked to process every day, the complexity of the global economy, the terrifying speed of technological change.
It's overwhelming.
It is simply too much for the human brain to logically map onto a single ballot box every 4 years. You just can't compute it.
The commentator touches on this, actually. He suggests it's a toxic cocktail of alienation, disenfranchisement, and deep-seated apathy.
Apathy, yeah.
When the world becomes too complex to understand, and when every political outcome seems to favor the ultra-wealthy regardless of who is in office, the voter retreats into tribalism.
They just give up on the policy.
They stop voting for policy and start voting purely for identity. They vote to punish their perceived enemies, even if the policy weapon they choose ends up detonating in their own backyard.
Wow. It is an incredibly heavy existential place to land.
It really is.
Let's take a deep breath and just trace the massive journey we have just taken today.
We covered a lot of ground.
We started by examining the quiet, sterile mechanics of the legal system. We looked at a 2-to-1 judicial ruling in a St. Louis appellate court that redefined the legal threshold of seeking admission, systematically stripping immigrants of their historical right to a basic bond hearing.
We saw how that one phrase changed everything.
Right. We then watched that legal abstraction become a physical reality, tracing its impact all the way down to the Rio Grande Valley.
Economic fallout.
Yes, we saw how ICE raids, empowered by these very legal frameworks, have absolutely crippled the South Texas construction industry, forcing desperate, bankrupt home builders to literally build fences around themselves just to survive the week.
Just incredible imagery there.
And finally, we unpack the profound philosophical despair of a political commentator who watched the very voters who champion these policies act genuinely shocked when the economic devastation arrived at their own doorsteps.
Which led us to that huge global question.
Yes, this led us to explore a deeply unsettling global crisis. The possibility that the modern information age has permanently broken the mechanism of democracy itself.
And, exploring that massive web of causality is exactly why we do these deep dives.
Because it matters.
It matters immensely because whether you are a small business owner navigating a broken supply chain, or a citizen voting in a local election, or even just someone trying to make sense of a political rant on YouTube,
Right.
the mechanics of these systems matter to you. This deep dive proves that the space between a flashy political campaign promise and a dry technical court ruling is not empty.
It's full of real life.
That space is filled with real consequences. It is where businesses declare bankruptcy. It is where human beings are locked in detention centers without bail. It is where the fabric of a community is either built or torn apart.
Exactly.
Understanding how the legal lever connects to the economic gear and how that gear grinds against the psychology of the voter is literally the only way to avoid being completely blindsided when the machinery of the state finally reaches your town.
That is the ultimate takeaway. You have to look past the rhetoric and understand the mechanics.
You have to.
And that leaves me with one final lingering question for you to mull over as you go about your day. We have seen how impossibly complex the modern political machine has become. We have seen voters eagerly championing policies that ultimately destroy their own livelihoods, basically because they didn't understand the fine print.
The unintended consequences.
Right. So where does the ultimate responsibility lie? Is it the burden of our politicians and our media to be radically more transparent, to stop selling us simplistic culture wars, and to explain the brutal realities of these policies before we vote on them?
Right.
Or, in an age where infinite information is available right in our pockets, is the burden entirely on us? Is it our responsibility as citizens to dig deeper, to reject the comforting political aesthetics, and to truly understand the mechanical reality of what we are voting for before we cast our ballots?
It's a heavy question.
It is. Because if we refuse to look at what the policy actually does, we shouldn't be surprised when we end up trapped behind a fence of our own making. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Stay curious, keep digging into the mechanics, and we will catch you next time.